The Middle East and Central Asian politics have been dominated by Islam, or rather Islamist movements, especially since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. There are 57 Muslim countries, 1.3 billion people, comprise roughly 21% of the world's population. Islamist movements claim that they stand for a return to the origins of Islam, the teaching of the Prophet Muhammad. They have become a force in Iran, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, Algeria, Palestine, Pakistan, and many other countries. The emergence of movement has been an enormous shock to the Western media and intellectuals. They believe that a wave of modernization after the victory of the anti-colonial struggle of the 1950s and 60s would inevitably lead to a decline of religious ideology. However, the opposite has been the case. Some scholars, including Western media, claim the rise of Islamist movements is a return to a restricted society and an attack on democracy and freedom. Others point out to the progressive anti-imperialist movements of the Islamists. They claim that the best possible solution to the problem of society is to return to the Prophet's time. So what is religion in general, and specifically Islam? When did it emerge? How has it evolved? This lecture attempts to answer these questions. This session is somewhat historical. By covering different periods, I want to demonstrate evolution of Islam, variety of interpretations, conservatism, reformism, and radical Islam. I want to show that against all the suggestions that Islamists has encouraged development. This session will show that in different periods, especially during Abbasid, the Islamic Empire was advanced in science, technology, and medicine. Indeed, today some so-called Islamic countries such as UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Iran, and Malaysia are economically very developed. Hence, I will highlight the line of continuity from the 7th century, the birth of Islam, and changes in the contemporary period. Religious ideas play an important role in history, but this is not in isolation from the rest of the material reality in society. The emergence of religion is through interaction within the community. Different religions have survived because they have been able to find a way to change their support base. For example, Islam has lived for so long because it has adapted itself first to a feudal society and now capitalism, changing much of its original teaching in the process. Hence, Islam has relied on different interpretations of the individuals or groups of people. For example, look at the countries that claim to be Islamists. The Islamic Republic of Iran or Saudi Arabia, do they function outside capitalism? Are they using 7th century ideas to manage their countries? Let's answer these questions by going back to the origin of Islam. To understand the origin of Islam, we must go back to the early late 6th and 7th century in the Arabian Peninsula. Islam was created at the particular point that society was going through a crisis. Muhammad emerged with a vision. He believed that God ordained him. He called for people to alter their behavior, that society must reorganize itself and deal with the deep crisis that Arabian Peninsula was facing at the time. As the map shows, Arabian Peninsula was sandwiched between two great empires. So naturally, this was a threat to their territory. Arabian Peninsula was fragile, not ruled by a formal government or a formal empire. The rule of law in most of the Arabian Peninsula was a tribal, where their tribe protected individuals. It was the law of vendetta and revenge that kept certain things in check. As a result, there was a lot of violence and death. The Bedouin had a nomadic life. They traveled through deserts, allowing their livestock to graze on whatever suitable land they found. Some people in Arabian Peninsula settled in places like Mecca, living on agriculture around oases. Despite some changes in nomadic lives, they did not leave behind all their ideas, including religious identities. The differences in their thoughts and religious beliefs led some to look for more established religions such as Judaism and Zoroastrianism, which developed earlier. There were also rivalries between different religious groups, disputing various interpretations of Christianity and Judaism. Arabian Peninsula had an additional feature. Often pastoralists, they did not only live by their herds, because they moved a long distance, trading goods between the centers of great civilization. For example, the map shows the connecting routes between Arabian Peninsula, Persian, Central Asia, China, India, the Roman Empire, Italy, and Egypt. Arabian Peninsula was the center of the trade routes. As a result, some of the tribal groups became wealthy and others living in different towns with diverse religions and cultural codes. However, once they settled down in cities, the old tribal way of maintaining peace began to break down. For example, if one tribe killed a member of the other tribe, this would lead to an act of revenge. As a result, they would have a complete breakdown of law and order, hence causing problems for the traders to continue their work. As some were traders, they traveled to different places, changing their old conception. Hence, they looked for another way of living. But for some, it was becoming unbearable to live under such a condition, leading to a situation of barbarity. This took place on the back of significant crises in the societies around the Arabian Peninsula. Parts of the Roman Empire disintegrating across North Africa, Egypt and Palestinian Syria, Constantinople and Balkans, much of the Mediterranean. The other empire was the Sassanids of Persia, which ran from the borders of Syria through Iraq into right across the boundaries of what is today Afghanistan, was also going through a difficult time. Two great empires, both going into various forms of crisis. They involved in the years of wars from about 580 onwards in a series of conflicts with each other. Devastating wars so that Roman Empire lost control of Egypt. This also had an impact on Arabian Peninsula, different groups being influenced by various. Against this background, a young Arab, Muhammad, was born into a reasonably prominent family, the Quraysh tribe, in Mecca in 570. The Quraysh tribe was essentially in control of Mecca, a very significant city that controlled because it was an important religious center for the region. This is now contemporary Kaaba, which exists today and is the center of Islamic worship, a place where Muslims, if they can afford it, financially they must visit once in their lifetimes. Before becoming an important religious center for Muslims, it was a house for pagans to worship hundreds of idols. In addition, various tribes and people of the Arabian Peninsula went to Mecca for both trading and worshipping their gods. And so one can imagine, as they made the pilgrimage towards Mecca to worship their idols, it also benefited the economy of Mecca in a significant way. Despite this, Muhammad's early life was quite a difficult one. First, his father died right before he was born. Then he lost his mother at the age of 6. After this, his grandfather took his custody. But then his grandfather died when he was 8 years old. And he goes straight under the custody of his uncle, Abu Talib. He was an orphan that was essentially trying to keep himself alive with basic necessity. As he grew older, he learned different skills. He becomes a merchant. He went on trading journey with his uncle, Abu Talib, to places like Syria. When he was 25 years old, he married a wealthy 40 years old widow from Mecca. She managed a vast trading enterprise. She employed Muhammad to work alongside her. Muhammad lived with her for 25 years until she died. Together, they developed moderately prosperous merchant enterprise. Muhammad, as a merchant, traveled from Mecca to as far as Palestine and back again. He came across different rival religions that settled their differences through war and violence. They also persecuted Jewish individuals and groups, Zoroastrians. Once he returned to Mecca, he became aware of the crisis inside Meccan society as well. He began to develop a vision that he believed God spoken to him. Between about 610, going right through to Muhammad's death in 632, a series of visions that he claimed God spoke to him about a society with new organization and values. He asked people to change their old way of life and called for a new scheme to be practically implemented in the Arabian Peninsula. Although not significantly different to established religions such as Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrian, his teaching had similarities with existing faith. Adherence to confess belief in one God, that he spoke through prophets, and that a day of judgment would come. They believed in hell and paradise, along with condemnation of idol worship. Muhammad's series of general ideas included how people should behave towards each other. He tried first to convince a group of his close friends and family. In Mecca, a small group of a dozen people joined him, but gradually attracted about 200 who became convinced of his vision. They decided to break with their own old tribal identities. They preached to the society where the old tribal codes were breaking down. Muhammad called for justice that should be applied equally to everyone. The rich should look after the poor, and in return, the latter should show loyalty to the wealthy, and women should be treated with respect. Muhammad spoke of brotherly and solidarity among Arabs, and a religious leader, and became the legislator for the city of Medina. He was a bridge between rival factions and made allies of them to present a united front against enemies. He included Jewish individuals in his alliance, as Muhammad never lost sight of his primary roles as a prophet sent by God for Arabs of all creeds. He adopted some religious practices from Judaism, including equivalent to the Jewish Day of Atonement and the tradition of praying in the direction of Jerusalem. His willingness to compromise was vital to the process of overcoming divisions within the community. This was a new image of society aimed to draw together people who were going through a deep crisis. Different interpretations of Arabian society is driven by great class division and suffering for the poor. There were three choices for Arabian society at the time. One, to keep the existing society as it was, which was almost impossible. Two, to reform the society, and this was not something that ruling elites would prepare to do. Three, to revolt against the rulers. At the early stage, Muhammad's ideas antagonized the rich, including his tribe in Mecca. He's known for saying that idol worship is a sin, that all of these idols are false idols. And so even the Quraysh tribe, where Muhammad belonged to, rejected his ideas. They persecuted the early Muslims so much so that many of the early Muslims, including Muhammad, had to migrate from Mecca to Medina, known as Hijrah for Muslims. Medina was also going through a crisis at the time, but different tribal groups allowed Muhammad to settle there. Some even got convinced by Muhammad's vision. Others battled against Muhammad's ideas. Finally, they succeeded in establishing a small society of people dedicated to changing their community and hoping for a better life. This was not just a religious mission, but it was a military and revolutionary project for uniting behind Muhammad and securing those who supported his program. Muhammad then built various alliances with pastoral tribal groups in the Arabian Peninsula to build a movement to bring the whole region under his influence. By 630, 10 years after he and his followers moved to Medina, he returned successfully to Mecca, but not without many wars. He established a hegemony for his form of the organization across the Arabian Peninsula. Both the rich and the poor accepted the new religion that they thought would benefit all of them. Muhammad died in 632, but the general crisis in the world around the Arabian Peninsula had not disappeared. His successors, those who had worked with him, were now able to lead the first Arab tribes in the peninsula and later elsewhere. Between 30 to 40 years, they conquered North Africa, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. At the beginning of the 8th century, they invaded Spain, moving right up into southern France. There are three different interpretations of how Islam was able to expand so fast and so successfully. One, they had military capacity and having a single religious vision to overcome the old antagonisms between the rich and poor among the Arab invaders. Two, the crisis of the whole societies people were under in Byzantine and Sassanid empires. They were looking for an alternative for the miserable condition that they were under. Some individuals from the rival religious groups, such as Christianity, with victories of the Arab army. They did not see the Arab invaders as an oppressor because of their religion. Byzantine and Sassanid empires were weakened after years of wars with one another. In addition, their economic turmoil and disease had a significant impact on their population. However, a long period of instability and dissatisfaction had left them unhappy with their previous rulers. The Arab Muslim conquerors took advantage of this and were familiar with Byzantine and Sassanid military tactics because they served in both armies. In some cities like Damascus and Spain, when the Arab armies appeared, some Jewish population were happy because it meant the end of their oppression at the hands of the Christian. So they spread messages that this is the new society that will overcome their problems. One political advantage that Arab leaders had was to maintain stability and unity among the Arab tribes. As a result, the feuding Arab tribes now united into a cohesive political force, partially through the promise of military conquest. However, this unity was tentative and ultimately led to significant divergence that disrupted state and religious institutions in the coming centuries. With the spread of the empire, it emerged contradictions that have continued to be with us today. The critical aspect of this religion was reconciliation between different groups to overcome this squabbling, fighting violence in the society that existed before, right to the emergence of Muhammad. The idea that the unity of Arab would remain for a long time became unsustainable as the rich began to focus on their wealth, forgetting the poor that they were struggling. In addition, the Arab leaders under Umayyad became corrupt and illegitimate. The growing struggle within the ruling elites led to a new leaders claiming legitimacy through shared lineage with the Prophet Muhammad and his uncle Abbas. Muhammad's successor, the Caliph, was political but not religious leader of Islam, and hence they had no legitimacy given by God. 30 years after Muhammad's death, a deep tension emerged between people who thought they lost what they gained with the emergence of the Arab Empire. The first battle was over who was going to become the political leader of the empire. But in reality, this was about who would control the power, and between those who had gained and those who lost from conquest. Debate raged about the nature of Islamic leadership and religious authority. These conflicts evolved into a major schism between Sunni and Shia. Finally, a civil war emerged between the rival Muslims armies, and some leaving thousands of deaths. One of the most critical break in Islam, which continues to divide Muslims in the region and worldwide, is that between the Sunni and Shia. The root cause of this division is the crisis of succession following the death of the Prophet Muhammad. This was resolved in favor of the Sunni when leading members of the community appointed Abu Bakr, father-in-law of Muhammad and one of the first of his followers. The Shiite faction argued that the Prophet's king had the greater right to become the community leader. They thus supported the succession claim of Ali, a cousin of the Prophet. The Shia also believed that the first three Caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Osman, were illegitimate, although at the time they did not openly challenge the prevailing order. Under these Caliphs, the ruling elites in the region increasingly gained control of the Khilafats' wealth, commerce, and trade. Their indulgence and extravagance and was resented by populace, especially the many poor laborers and landless peasants, resulting in uprising that culminated in the assassination of Ottoman in 656 AD. The battle for leadership between Shia and Sunni is part of a power struggle and suffering from below. As before, a different version of Islam had emerged, but this time to liberate the struggling masses. The first empire lasted for about 100 to 120 years after the Prophet's death. Around the middle of the 8th century, revolutionary movement erupted. In part of Iran and Syria, established a new ruling order, Abbasid Empire, between 750 to 258. The empire cooperated non-Islamic to Arabism. In the beginning, they were supported by Shia minorities as well. Naturally, the Abbasid differentiated themselves from the predecessors, even though they had a lot in common. They changed the social hierarchy by constructing a more inclusive government in Baghdad, a cosmopolitan capital city. The distinction between Arab Muslims and non-Arab Muslims diminished, with Persian culture exerting a greater influence on the Abbasid court. It was a period that the combination of a new ideology and a new organization in society unleashed the capacity of people to create more wealth and advance technology. The new doctrine broke down sectarian splits between Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and Judaism, opened the space for the Muslim rulers to take control. Regardless of their religion, Abbasid invited scholars and scientists to research and develop a new technique in medicine, agriculture, industries, and architecture. They developed crafts with the introduction of paper making, advanced in ceramics, pottery making, and on top of all, this was fantastic advance in knowledge and understanding. The unification of the vast area, as the map shows, from the Straits of Gibraltar through to the site of Afghanistan, one of the most prosperous and productive area of the world. There is a myth propagated by some that there was very development under Islamic Empire. There was an incredible advance in all sorts of crops, which existed only in India or Africa. Muslim orthodoxy was not something written down by the Prophet Muhammad. Different versions of the Quran existed 100 years of the Islamic conquest. There is further evidence of how he wrote his ideas. It is not clear. Muhammad knew how to read and write. There were several discussions between Muslim scholars how the text should be understood and how to put the ideas together in one book. Furthermore, they later developed the hadith, the saying of the Prophet. Hence, you have to ask hundreds of people to tell you precisely what the people had said. Hence, you have different interpretation of what he meant. Abbasid Empire, like Umayyad, faced internal and external crises. The failing economy, losing its prime position in the Silk Road route, and competition between different rulers to keep control of wealth. They began to lose control of their outer territory once it became obvious that they were incompetent to keep a struggling poor happy. Finally, Abbasid Empire eventually fell in 1258 to Mongol invaders. Since the collapse of Abbasid Empire, Islam has continued to survive. In the late 13th century, the Ottoman Empire developed a base in what is now Turkey. They expanded their territory throughout the Middle East until World War I. They were defeated by the Western armies of Britain and France. Since World War I, the Middle East has been dominated by great powers, although the national leaders have collaborated with them. The Middle East since the 1970s has faced enormous challenges. One such example is the rise of Islamist movements. With the growing political crisis, failure of nationalism, over 1,300 years later, Islam has again emerged as a liberator by the Islamist movements. Islam continues to play multiple roles. What seems to be obvious that Islamists never rejected the dominant economic power. The revival of Islam in Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen is not a return to the practice of the prophets in 7th century, but it is about reshaping people's behavior into something entirely new. Just like how the prophets tried to convince his followers at the time. So the aspiration to create the past glory of Islam involves not leaving existing society intact, but reshaping it. Thank you.